You think I don't understand you? The words didn't come from the table, but from behind it, steady and low, and for a brief second, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Just moments earlier, Richard Caldwell had leaned back in his leather chair, one arm draped casually over the side, his voice slipping into a sharp, fluid stream of Arabic that cut clean through the soft jazz and clinking glasses. The tone wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, each syllable shaped with precision, meant to exclude, to diminish, to test. A few nearby diners glanced up, confused but curious, sensing something off in the cadence, even if they couldn't decode it. Richard's lips curled slightly at the edge as he finished, eyes fixed on the young black waitress standing beside the table, waiting, watching, as if expecting her to falter. Ava Williams didn't move right away. The small order pad in her hand remained untouched, her fingers resting lightly against the paper, still as glass. The overhead pendant lights cast a warm amber glow across the polished wood tables, reflecting faintly in her eyes, but there was nothing uncertain in her gaze. Around them, the restaurant breathed in quiet fragments, silverware brushing porcelain, ice settling in glasses, the low hum of conversation returning in cautious waves. Richard tapped the table once with his index finger, a soft, impatient rhythm, as if to remind her of her place in the exchange. He repeated the last phrase again, slower this time, his tone laced with something colder, something intentional. At a nearby table, a couple exchanged a glance. A server paused mid-step, tray balanced carefully in one hand, sensing the shift in the air without fully understanding it. Ava's shoulders rose slightly with a controlled breath, then fell. Her posture remained upright, composed, but something deeper moved beneath the surface, something that didn't belong to this room, to this moment. When she finally spoke, her voice entered the space not as a reaction, but as a correction, clear, measured, and in the same language he had just used, each word placed with quiet authority. The effect was immediate. The subtle rhythm of the room broke. A fork hovered midair at the table behind them. The bartender's hand paused halfway through polishing a glass. Richard's expression didn't collapse, not fully, but it shifted, just enough to reveal the fracture beneath the surface confidence. Ava didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean in. She simply translated, accurately, completely, the sentence he thought had gone unheard, including the part he had never intended anyone else to understand. And then she stopped, letting the silence do the rest. The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a thread being pulled from the center of the room, leaving everything slightly off balance. Ava Williams stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her order pad still untouched, but now the space around her felt different, heavier, as if the air itself had shifted its weight. The warm amber light above cast a soft sheen along the edge of the table, catching the faint outline of her name tag. Williams, printed in simple black letters, steady and unremarkable, just like the role she was expected to play, just like the role she had learned to disappear into. 8 hours earlier, she had tied that same apron in the narrow back hallway of the restaurant, fingers moving with practiced ease, the fabric worn smooth from years of repetition. The scent of brewed coffee and lemon cleaner had lingered in the air as the morning crew moved around her in quiet routines, clocks ticking, chairs being set, menus aligned with careful precision. Ava had not spoken much. She never did. Her presence in the room had always been soft, almost invisible, the kind that made people comfortable enough not to notice. That was how she had survived, not just here, but long before this place, long before the city lights and polished floors. There had been other rooms, louder ones, harsher ones, where words carried weight far beyond their sound, where a single sentence could shift the direction of a conversation, a deal, a life. She had learned to listen in those rooms first, to catch meaning beneath tone, intention beneath language, to understand not just what was said, but why it was said. But those days had ended quietly, without ceremony, replaced by something simpler, something safer, at least on the surface. Now, standing in the middle of this polished dining room, she felt the familiar tension return, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, sharp and precise. Across from her, Richard Caldwell leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers now resting against the rim of his glass, no longer tapping, no longer performing. His eyes remained on her, studying, measuring, recalculating something that no longer fit as neatly as it had just moments ago. Around them, the restaurant began to breathe again, cautiously, conversations resuming in low tones, but not quite as carefree as before. A man at the next table glanced down at his menu, then back up again, as if trying to piece together what he had just witnessed without having all the parts. Ava lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in thought, her mind moving through the exchange with quiet clarity. She had not planned to speak. She rarely did more than necessary. But some words, once heard, could not be left alone, not when they carried the kind of meaning that turned people into something smaller than they were. Her grip on the order pad tightened slightly, just enough to ground her, to remind her where she was now. A waitress, a job, a paycheck that covered rent, groceries, and the stack of medical bills sitting on her kitchen counter at home. Simple things, necessary things. She lifted her eyes again, calm, steady, waiting, not for permission, not for approval, but for whatever came next. Richard Caldwell did not look away, but something in his posture changed, subtle enough that most would have missed it, the slight tightening of his jaw. The way his fingers curled just a fraction closer around the glass in his hand, no longer relaxed, no longer performing for the room, but reacting to it. He was a man accustomed to control, to entering any space and bending it to his rhythm, his tone, his expectations, and for years that had worked without resistance. Boardrooms, negotiations, private dinners where language itself became a tool to separate those who belonged from those who did not. He had built his reputation on precision, on reading people before they spoke, on staying 3 steps ahead in conversations that others struggled to follow, and it had made him powerful, untouchable in ways that extended far beyond wealth. This, however, was not a boardroom. This was a restaurant, a controlled environment where the hierarchy was supposed to be simple, predictable, reinforced by uniforms, by titles, by the quiet agreement that some voices carried weight and others carried service. Ava had disrupted that without raising her voice, without stepping forward, without doing anything that could be dismissed as inappropriate or out of place, and that made it harder to correct, harder to contain. Richard set his glass down slowly, the faint clink against the table sharper than it should have been in the softened atmosphere. He leaned forward just slightly, enough to re-establish presence, enough to remind the space around him who he was supposed to be in it. When he spoke again, his voice returned to English, but the edge remained, controlled, deliberate. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, each word measured, not out of curiosity alone, but out of recalibration, as if understanding her answer might restore the balance he had just lost. Ava did not answer immediately. Her eyes held his for a moment, not confrontational, not defiant, but steady in a way that refused to shrink. The sounds of the restaurant continued to rebuild around them, plates being set down, quiet laughter returning at distant tables. But closer in, within the radius of their exchange, there was still a pocket of suspended attention, a quiet awareness that something real had just passed between them. Ava shifted her weight slightly, the fabric of her apron brushing softly against her uniform, grounding her again in the present. "I used to listen," she said finally, her voice even, simple, but carrying more meaning than the words alone suggested. Richard's brow tightened almost imperceptibly. "That is not an answer," he replied, though the firmness in his tone lacked the earlier confidence, as if he was testing whether authority could still be reasserted through language alone. Ava lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again, her expression unchanged. "It is the only one that matters," she said, and for a moment, that was enough to shift the weight of the conversation once more. At a nearby table, someone exhaled quietly, unaware they had been holding their breath. The illusion of control did not shatter, but it cracked, just enough to let something human through, something uncertain, something that could no longer be ignored. Richard did not respond right away, and that hesitation, small as it was, lingered longer than any sharp reply could have. The low hum of the restaurant continued to rebuild around them, but it no longer sounded the same, as if the rhythm had shifted half a beat off from what it had been before. A server passed behind Ava carrying a tray of water glasses, the ice inside them chiming softly with each step, a fragile, ordinary sound that contrasted against the quiet tension still hanging in the air. Richard leaned back again, but this time the motion felt less like control and more like recalculation, as though he were stepping back from a line he had not expected to cross. His gaze drifted briefly across the room, taking in the subtle awareness in nearby faces, the way conversations dipped when voices rose too close to their table, the way attention moved without being obvious. He was used to being observed, admired even, but not questioned, not quietly undone in a space that was supposed to reinforce his position. His fingers tapped once against the table again, but the rhythm lacked the earlier certainty, uneven now, thoughtful. Ava remained still, grounded in the narrow space between expectation and choice, her presence neither retreating nor advancing. The soft fabric of her sleeve brushed lightly against her wrist as she adjusted her grip on the order pad, the small motion anchoring her in the role she had not stepped out of, even now. Richard's eyes returned to her, sharper this time, more focused, as if searching for something that had not been there before. He switched again, this time into another language, faster, more complex, the cadence tighter, the phrasing layered with nuance that most would not catch even if they recognized the sound. It was not loud, not aggressive, but it carried intention, a second attempt, a different angle, a test wrapped inside precision. The words moved quickly, almost blending into one another, designed to slip past understanding or expose its limits. A man seated 2 tables over glanced up again, unable to follow the meaning but sensing the shift in tone. Ava listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle difference now, a quiet recognition, as if she had seen this pattern before, not just here, but somewhere far removed from polished tables and controlled lighting. When Richard finished, the final word hanging just slightly longer than the rest, he leaned back again, waiting, not with the same confidence as before, but with expectation, as though the outcome still belonged to him. Ava inhaled slowly, the movement almost imperceptible, then exhaled with the same control, her voice entering the space once more, calm, precise, and in that same language, matching his speed but not his intent. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She spoke clearly, correcting not just the structure of what he had said, but the meaning beneath it, adjusting a phrase here, a tone there, until what remained was no longer a veiled remark but a direct statement, stripped of its disguise. The effect was immediate and quiet, like a light shifting in a room without anyone touching the switch. Richard's expression held for a moment, then faltered just enough to be seen. Ava finished, then paused, her gaze meeting his again, not challenging, not soft, simply present. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was deliberate, and it belonged to her. The words settled into the space between them with a clarity that could not be undone, and for the first time since the exchange began, Richard Caldwell did not immediately respond. His lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no sound followed, only a faint shift in his expression, something caught between recognition and resistance. Around them, the restaurant had not gone silent, not entirely, but the energy had changed in a way that could be felt more than heard. A glass was set down a little too carefully at the bar. A chair scraped softly against the floor, then stilled. Even the music, low and steady through hidden speakers, seemed to drift into the background, no longer leading the room, but following it. Richard's hand moved again toward his glass, then stopped halfway, his fingers hovering just above the rim, as if unsure whether to continue a motion that no longer felt natural. He looked at Ava again, not the way he had before, not as someone evaluating or testing, but as someone trying to understand how the structure he relied on had shifted without warning. "You are correcting me," he said finally, his voice quieter now, still controlled, but stripped of the earlier sharpness, as if each word had to pass through something heavier before reaching the air. Ava did not flinch. Her shoulders remained relaxed, her posture unchanged, but there was a steadiness in her presence that held its ground without effort. "I am clarifying what you said," she replied, her tone even, neither apologetic nor confrontational, simply precise. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose, a controlled breath that carried more weight than it should have. He leaned forward, slightly, his elbows nearing the table, narrowing the distance between them, But the shift did not reclaim authority. It only revealed how much of it had already slipped. "You assume intent," he said, the words measured, searching for ground that might still hold. Ava's gaze did not waver. "No," she answered, "I understand intent, and the difference between what is said and what is meant." The statement did not rise, did not push, but it landed with quiet finality. A man seated behind Richard lowered his fork, no longer pretending not to listen. At the far end of the room, a server paused beside a table, waiting for an order that had already been given, her attention pulled elsewhere. Richard's jaw tightened briefly, then released, the tension visible in the subtle shift along his cheek. For a moment, it seemed as though he might push further, might return to the structure he knew, but something held him back, something unspoken that had begun to take shape in the silence between them. Ava adjusted the edge of her order pad with her thumb, a small, grounding motion, then spoke again, softer this time, but no less clear. "Words do not lose their meaning just because the person hearing them is not expected to understand," she said. The sentence moved through the space without resistance, not as an attack, not as a defense, but as a statement that no longer required validation. Richard's eyes remained on her, but the certainty behind them had shifted, replaced by something more complex, something that could not be resolved with another question or another test. And for the first time since he had spoken that first sentence, he had nothing ready to replace the silence that followed. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt full, dense with everything that had just been said and everything that no longer needed to be. Ava stood still, but not rigid, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, as if she had stepped into a space she recognized, one shaped not by power but by truth, something quieter, harder to ignore. The light above shifted slightly as someone passed beneath it, casting a brief shadow across the table, then returning to that same warm glow that now seemed softer, less performative, more real. In the reflection of the polished surface, her hands appeared steady, the order pad resting lightly. Between her fingers, no longer just a tool of service, but something grounding, something that kept her present in a moment that could easily pull her elsewhere. Across from her, Richard Caldwell remained seated, but his stillness was different now. Not controlled, not calculated, but reflective, as if the weight of the exchange had finally settled into place. His eyes dropped briefly to the table, tracing the faint ring left by his glass, the small imperfection in an otherwise flawless surface, and for a moment, that seemed to hold his attention more than anything else in the room. Around them, the restaurant continued, but at a distance, like a sound heard through glass, present but softened, the details less sharp, less important. A server walked past with a quiet apology to another table. A low laugh rose and faded near the window, but none of it reached the center of where they stood. Ava inhaled slowly, the air cool against her lungs, then let it out just as gently, her gaze drifting, not away, but outward, taking in the room without focusing on any one thing. There was a stillness in her that did not come from avoidance, but from understanding, the kind that did not need to be explained or defended. For a brief second, her eyes caught the reflection of the city lights beyond the glass, faint outlines of movement, cars passing, people walking, a world continuing without pause, without awareness of what had just unfolded inside this room. And yet, within this space, something had shifted in a way that would not easily return to what it had been. Richard finally lifted his head again, his expression no longer guarded, but searching, not for a response, but for meaning, as if the conversation had moved beyond language into something harder to define. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, the words he might have chosen no longer fitting the moment. Ava did not fill the silence. She did not offer explanation or justification. She simply stood there, present, allowing the weight of what had been revealed to remain where it was. The quiet between them stretched, but it did not strain. It settled, like dust after movement, like water after a ripple. And in that stillness, without any need for volume or force, the balance had changed completely. Richard Caldwell had spent years believing that. Understanding a language meant owning the room it was spoken in. That fluency gave him control not just over words but over people, over perception, over outcomes. But as he sat there now, something in that belief began to unravel, not all at once, but in quiet, undeniable pieces. His gaze lifted again to Ava, but this time it did not measure or test. It searched, as if trying to reconcile the person standing in front of him with the assumptions he had already made and now could no longer defend. The polished surface of the table reflected both of them in faint distortion, his tailored suit, her simple uniform, two roles that had once seemed clearly defined, now blurred at the edges by something neither of them had planned. "You said you used to listen," he began, his voice slower now, more careful, as if each word needed to pass through thought before reaching sound. "What does that mean?" The question did not carry authority anymore. It carried something closer to uncertainty. Ava did not respond immediately. Her eyes shifted slightly, not away from him, but inward, as if reaching back through memory rather than forward into explanation. The soft hum of the restaurant continued around them, but it felt distant again, secondary to what was unfolding at the table. She drew in a breath, steady, controlled, then spoke, her voice quieter than before, but clearer, more grounded. "It means I learned to hear what people hide inside their words," she said, "and what they think no one else will understand." Richard's expression tightened, not in resistance, but in recognition, as if something in that statement had reached beyond the moment and touched something older, something familiar. Ava continued, not raising her voice, not shifting her stance, but allowing the truth to unfold without force. "There are places where language is not just communication," she said, "it is survival. You learn quickly what a sentence can do depending on who hears it and who does not." A pause followed, brief but heavy. She looked at him again, steady, present. "And you just used it to make someone smaller," she added, not accusing, not emotional, simply stating what had already been revealed. The words did not echo, they settled, firm and complete. Richard did not look away this time. His fingers, which had rested against the table, slowly withdrew, folding together as if containing something that had begun to shift inside him. Around them, a quiet awareness remained, subtle but persistent, as if the room itself understood that something deeper than a conversation had taken place. Ava's presence did not change. She did not step forward, did not retreat. She remained exactly where she was, grounded in the truth she had spoken, leaving no space for misinterpretation. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without asking for acknowledgement, she had done something far more powerful than responding. She had made him see. Richard's gaze did not break from hers, but the certainty that once anchored it was gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier, as if he had stepped into a space where his usual instincts no longer applied. The restaurant continued around them, but now it felt like a backdrop rather than a stage, the soft clinking of glasses and low conversations no longer shaping the moment, only surrounding it. A faint reflection of the city lights shimmered across the window beside them, streaks of white and red from passing cars stretching and dissolving across the glass, constant motion outside a space that had come to a complete standstill within. Richard exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a way that felt less controlled, less measured, as though it carried something he had not expected to confront. "I did not think anyone would understand it," he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of performance, almost uncertain in its honesty. Ava did not move closer, did not soften her stance, but there was no distance in her presence either, only clarity. "That is usually the point," she replied, her tone even, not sharp, not forgiving, simply truthful. Richard's hand shifted slightly on the table, his fingers brushing the surface as if grounding himself in something tangible, something real. For a moment, he looked down again, not avoiding her, but processing, tracing the line between intention and impact that had just been drawn in front of him. When he looked back up, there was no trace of the earlier challenge in his eyes, only recognition, and something that followed it, something closer to regret, though he did not name it. "I should not have said it," he admitted, the words simple, unadorned, but carrying more weight than anything he had spoken before. Ava held his gaze for a brief second. Longer, then nodded once, not as acceptance, not as dismissal, but as acknowledgement, the kind that does not erase what happened but allows it to exist without distortion. Around them, the room seemed to ease, not noticeably, but subtly, like a held breath finally released. A server resumed walking past their table, the soft rhythm of footsteps returning to something normal, something uninterrupted. Ava glanced down at her order pad, then back at him. The shift small but meaningful, a return to the role she had never fully left. "Are you ready to order?" she asked, her voice calm, professional, but not detached, grounded in the same quiet strength that had carried her through the entire exchange. Richard paused, just for a second, then gave a slight nod, the motion unforced, genuine in a way that had not been present before. "Yes," he said, and this time, he spoke in plain English, each word clear, unhidden, as if understanding now required no barrier, no distance, no disguise. Ava wrote it down without comment, her pen moving smoothly across the paper, the simple act carrying a sense of closure that did not need to be spoken. When she finished, she tore the small sheet cleanly along the edge and turned, her steps measured, steady, leaving behind a table that no longer held the same meaning it had just minutes ago. And Richard remained seated, watching her walk away, not with judgment, not with curiosity, but with the quiet awareness that something in him had been seen and could not be unseen. The door to the kitchen swung open and closed in a steady rhythm as Ava moved through it, the noise of the dining room fading behind her, replaced by the hum of dishwashers, the hiss of steam, and the low, familiar cadence of a space that did not pause for anything. She placed the order slip on the metal counter with a soft tap, the paper lying flat beneath the fluorescent lights, just another ticket among many, indistinguishable from the rest. No one asked her anything. No one needed to. She reached for a glass, filled it halfway with water, and took a slow sip, the coolness grounding, the moment settling into her the way it always did after something that could not be undone. Out in the dining room, Richard Caldwell remained seated, but the room around him no longer felt like it belonged to him. The table, the lighting, the quiet attention of the staff, all of it was still there, unchanged in appearance, but altered in meaning. He looked down at the place where his glass had been, at the faint ring left behind, and for a moment, it seemed more significant than anything else in front of him. The words he had spoken earlier did not echo, they lingered, not in sound, but in understanding, clearer now than when he had first said them. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes drifting across the room, not searching for validation, not measuring reactions, but noticing, for the first time, the details he had overlooked before. The way a server adjusted a chair for an older couple near the window, the way a young man at the bar leaned forward to listen more closely to the person across from him, the quiet, unspoken exchanges that made the space what it was. None of it was extraordinary, but none of it was insignificant either. Ava returned a few minutes later, her steps measured, her posture the same, her presence unchanged, but something in the air between them had settled into a quiet understanding that no longer needed to be addressed. She placed the glass of water in front of him, the condensation forming instantly against the surface, a small detail, ordinary, precise. "Thank you," he said, the words simple, but this time without distance, without calculation. Ava gave a slight nod, not lingering, not withdrawing, simply acknowledging what was there. She turned to leave again, her reflection catching briefly in the polished edge of a nearby mirror, the name on her tag visible for just a second before she moved past it. Richard watched that reflection disappear, not with the curiosity he once carried, but with a stillness that felt earned, as if something in him had finally aligned with something outside of himself. He reached for the glass, took a small sip, and set it back down carefully, the motion unhurried, intentional. The conversation was over, but its weight remained, not as a burden, but as a shift, quiet and irreversible. And in the soft hum of the restaurant, with nothing left to prove and nothing left to say, the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was understood. If this story stayed with you, go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. In the next video, I will talk about the story, Billionaire mocked the black waitress in French. Seconds later, her reply left him silent. See you in the next video. Thank you for watching.